turn it over to Barry Bowman, who's the chairman of our program committee, and to introduce the speaker. Barry?
Okay, so today's speaker is Gail Hershatter. Gail grew up in Connecticut, went as an undergraduate to Hampshire College, which shares some similarities to Santa Cruz in its early days, although they turned out rather differently as institutions. PhD from Stanford, position at Williams College, and then came here to UCSC. So I think it's fair to say that Gail is truly one of the academic stars on our campus. Guggenheim Fellow, winner of our annual research award, member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Gail is really one of the superb research people on campus. And it's also important to note that Gail has been a good citizen. In this room, I know there are people who remember the Millennium Committee. Gail co-chaired that. Talk about a sacrifice. Wow. So, her work is in the area of modern Chinese history with a focus on women and labor. And so, Gail.
Thank you. This is on. It's low enough. Yep. That seems good. Is that warming up? What's it doing? All right. I'll say a few things while it's warming up. Thank you, Barry, for that, and thank you all for the chance to be here. As I contemplate joining the ranks of the Emeriti in a couple of years, it's nice to see the company is so good on this side. I'm also really pleased that my mother, Evelyn Hershatter, and her friend Robert Beck are with us today. Frankly, I can't think of a more intimidating audience than, on the one hand, all my senior colleagues, and on the other hand, my mom. So you're going to have to bear with me. Okay. Almost 10 years ago, a publisher approached me to write a book on Chinese women's history over the last 2 centuries that could be used in graduate and undergraduate teaching. I usually had the sense to turn down these kinds of requests, and I had turned down several, but this time I said yes, for 2 reasons. First, I was about to start chairing my department, and I knew that was a wrong time to be starting a major new research project that required me to go to China all the time. Somehow, I foolishly thought that chairing would provide me with extra time to work on a teaching book. Okay, clearly I had no idea what chairing entails, and I'm much wiser now. But the second reason was intellectual. I began my professional life as a China historian at a time when there was less than a handful of books in English on women and gender in China. Once, when a friend and colleague a bit older than I told a senior personage in our field that she was going to write a history of women in late imperial China, he looked at her gravely and said, "That would be a fine idea if there were any materials to base it on, but there aren't." Some of you may know her, Susan Mann, who used to teach here. She went on to write 2 prize-winning and very well-sourced books on the subject. During my professional lifetime, this field has expanded so rapidly that many fine monographs and dozens, if not hundreds, of articles are published every year. So I thought it was time to take stock. What had become of this field, the history of Chinese women, that I had participated in creating? We often like to make the claim that adding a serious consideration of women to our understanding of Chinese history would not be like adding a spice, as in add women and stir, but rather that it would alter the field fundamentally. Had we scholars delivered collectively on that claim? And what was it we most wanted our students to learn that could help them to think about the world of the past and the world that they now inhabit? So I said, yes, I would write the book, and there it is, and here it is. I'll pass a copy around. This is not a promotional book tour. Let me just say that this turned out to be the most difficult piece of scholarly work I had ever done. Normally, I write to suit myself, I will confess to all of you, but now I felt like I had a multitude of judges, one set looking over each shoulder. On one side, the community of scholars in the US, Europe, China, and elsewhere who have produced a history of women and gender over the past 45 years or so. I used my own research in the book, of course, but I used theirs too. Was I getting it right? Was I doing them justice? Looking over the other shoulder, I could feel my UCSC students. One eye on the page and the other wandering towards Snapchat or the latest meme site. My students nowadays were born digital. And although they are as curious and bright as ever, they are used to dividing their attention among lots of competing sources. Could I write a sentence that would compel them to read the next sentence, given all the alluring content out there competing for their eyeballs? I don't know yet whether I succeeded on the student front. We'll have to see. This book has been out less than 2 months. But today I want to share with you the kind of afterthoughts one has after finishing this kind of a book. First, I'll talk about the kind of stories scholars have conventionally told about women in modern Chinese history and why they are not yet good enough. Second, I'll introduce 2 major themes that run throughout the book and that I think are worth exploring with students, themes that might lead us to a better, more complex story about the place of women and gender in Chinese and other history. And third, I want to offer a few examples about the limits of historical research and knowledge, things we don't get to know about the human past, no matter how deep our curiosity. Those are the stubborn silences of my talk title today. So, when scholars first started looking at the history of women in modern China, we were very much focused on China's revolutions, the one that toppled 2,000 years of dynastic rulers in 1911, and the one that brought communism to China in 1949. Much of the early scholarship made the point that women were there too, and the focus was on their heroic political roles. For instance, there was the firebrand teacher Qiu Jin, beheaded in 1907 by the Qing dynasty for association with anti-dynastic revolutionaries. There was the teacher, journalist, and revolutionary Tang Chunying, who fought for women's suffrage in the 19-teens. She delivered the most famous public slap in modern Chinese history, storming a meeting of the Nationalist Party to denounce the male party leaders for eliminating women's suffrage from their platform. There were the poor peasant women like the ones on my book cover who were organized into village defense militias by the communist government, the communist movement, as it gained strength in poor rural areas in the 1930s and 1940s. If you look closely at this picture, you can see that they are marching on their bound feet, a topic I will come back to later. And there were the women heroines of socialist construction in the 1950s and 1960s who took on new roles for women, like welding and tractor driving. Now, this celebratory story of women triumphantly joining the revolution and being liberated by it quickly gave way to a more skeptical set of studies. One place where scholars trained their gimlet eyes was rural China under Mao Zedong in the 1950s and 1960s. They noted that even while the Chinese Communist Party was reshaping Chinese villages by expropriating landlords and collectivizing agriculture, they could not seem to make headway on another policy, marriage reform. In 1950, the new Chinese Communist government issued a new marriage law. It outlawed bigamy, concubinage, child betrothal. This is from an illustrated book that was used to publicize the policy to people that were marginally literate. Interfering with the remarriage of widows was outlawed, exacting money or gifts in a marriage transaction, and compelling people to marry against their will, all outlawed. It also permitted divorce when both parties desired it, effectively increasing the divorce rights of women who hadn't had much in the way of that, and required a court decision in contested divorces. In spite of this happy poster, which is one of many of this kind, this policy was widely feared and disliked in Chinese villages. Marriage in China was patrilocal. The bride moved into the village and home of her husband's parents and became part of his family. Poor families started saving years ahead of time to bring in a bride for their son. The idea that such a wife, the result of years of scrimping and saving, could just walk out, depriving her husband's family of her labor and also taking their investment with her, horrified not only men, but also mothers-in-law, who counted on the wives of their sons to help ease their household labor burden as they entered old age. The marriage law soon became known as the divorce law, and local officials declined to push it very hard in the face of a resentful populace, especially because they needed those people, including both men and women, to support the new government and come out and work hard for socialist construction. This is one of my favorite pictures because it looks, these women are learning how to harrow, to break up the soil, a task that had formerly been reserved to men. The idea was if a woman touched the soil, the crops would all fail. But they look like they're in a driver ed class, which effectively they are. There's none of this celebratory stuff like you see in the propaganda posters. People are trying really hard not to fall over sideways and to do it right. So feminist scholars looked at this revolutionary backpedaling on the part of the state. We're not going to push marriage reform because it will get in the way of our other priorities, as well as the fact that women who did come into the fields were routinely paid less than men. In fact, whatever job a woman did was paid less than a man, even though women kept moving into jobs that men had formerly done, like this one. Scholars concluded that what women had experienced was not quite a revolution, but rather, as one put it, a revolution postponed. Or even worse, a revolution sold out. So the story went, women were there too, but they were getting shortchanged. Okay, now both of these stories have considerable merit. Women's lives were changed by the long Chinese Revolution. And women did experience backpedaling and gender discrimination. But the problem with both of these stories is that they both are organized around the events of high politics, attempting to show that women were there too. And that in turn leaves history intact, rather than asking what I think is the central question. If we place women at the center of our account of China's past 2 centuries, how does this change our understanding of what happened? Does big history itself shift if we ask that question? So here are the 2 major themes that emerged for me as most important in looking back at Chinese women's lives and their intersection with big history across the past 2 centuries. The first theme has to do with women's labor. We need to pay attention to women's labor, both publicly visible in workplaces and hidden inside the home. The labor of women in domestic and public spaces shaped China's move from empire to republic, to socialist nation, to most recently rising capitalist power. Some of that labor was recognized by state authorities and intellectuals. Some of it, however, was not so visible in the historical record. So let me give you just 2 examples about women's labor. The first one comes from the 19th century, although this particular picture is almost a millennium sooner than that. In both elite homes and poor ones in the late empire, households could not have survived without the labor of women. And that is partly because elite men, this is what you're seeing here, often spent decades studying for and trying to pass national civil service examinations, which required that they memorize and comment on the Confucian classics. Only by starting study for these exams at about the age of 3 in elite households, because you've got to memorize everything before you can comment on it. Only by passing these exams could a man hope to become an official. Preparation could require a man to spend years away from home, during which he had little income to send back. Then, if a man passed the exam and actually became an official, his posting often took him far from home. This left his wife to manage the household, including the household finances, and keep up appearances, which meant that she could not appear too much in public or directly produce anything for sale, and had to skimp on the family's food and clothing so that she could give appropriate gifts on ritual occasions. She might discreetly sell her jewelry or her calligraphy to help make ends meet. Her other duties included managing the family land holdings, which included collecting the rents and dealing with a lot of conflictual situations, caring for the man's aging parents, raising the children he conceived on his infrequent visits home, educating the sons until they began their own exam study under tutors, teaching the daughters to read and do needlework for their dowries, and arranging appropriate marriages for all the children. That's the elite families. Among farming women in poor households, the responsibilities were somewhat different, but the burden was even greater. Women's feet were bound, even in poor households, but that did not prevent wives and daughters from accompanying men to the field. Of course, women were not ideally supposed to be seen outside, but the demands of production were so intense at transplanting and harvest time that everyone's labor had to be mobilized. And bound feet were perfectly compatible with the spinning and weaving that women and girls performed at home without needing to venture into public spaces. Textile production was much praised as a womanly activity and often made a crucial contribution to household income, enabling farmers not only to clothe themselves, but to pay their taxes on time. And yet, as China slid into crisis at the end of the 19th century, prominent male thinkers forgot all about the labor that women up and down the social spectrum performed for long hours every day. Liang Qichao, a famous late Qing dynasty critic, argued in 1897 that the way China treated its women made the empire weak and opened it up to incursions by foreign imperialists. He advocated for women's education, and that way he was taking a very progressive stance, but in the process he belittled or ignored their economic contributions. Liang declared that among the nation's 200 million women, quote, all are consumers and none are producers, unquote, erasing with one phrase women's contribution to the household economy and production for the market. It was because they could not support themselves, he believed, that men treated them as slaves. This misrecognition of women's labor is particularly puzzling in light of the experience of Liang's own mother. A 1915 article by Liang's daughter suggests that the labor of Liang's mother was largely responsible for the success of Liang and his brothers, and that the mother also taught embroidery to village women, prepared meals for 10 hired laborers on the family estate, and did much of the housework. So much for they only consume, they don't produce. My second example of how women's labor was indispensable comes from the mid-20th century, when the Chinese Communist Party state undertook an ambitious economic drive to build a strong socialist industrialized China. The funding for that effort was to come mainly from the countryside, where women's labor was at the heart of the party's drive to raise agricultural production. Women were encouraged to participate year-round in collective agriculture, where their labor could help raise productivity in the fields and free up the labor of some male farmers to work in other collective enterprises, such as machine repair, flour milling, irrigation works, anything slightly more technical, less physically demanding, and higher paid. Men tracked off into those jobs. And the labor force in basic level agriculture was increasingly feminized. The socialist discourse on labor had little to say about domestic labor. They said, in the future, when communism comes, this will all be collectivized. And we're not there yet. Meanwhile, women and their families saw domestic labor as women's responsibility. A fully committed shift at the workplace or in the fields, followed by a second unremunerated shift at home, was a standard feature of life for women. In the countryside, women routinely worked shorter hours than men in the collective fields, but they put in longer days. They came late to the fields after caring for children and preparing the morning meal. They left early to cook at noontime and before dinner. Often they labored in the fields with small children on their backs. They brought children and needlework to political meetings. And perhaps the most taxing feature of the lives of married women farmers in the collective socialist period was the hidden night shift of labor they performed. After dinner time, or when evening production planning meetings were over, women settled down at home to spin thread, weave cloth, and sew clothing and shoes, and make shoe soles for their ever-increasing numbers of children. Many villages didn't get electricity till the early 1970s, so this work was conducted well into the night under the light of oil lamps. Essential as they were, the clothing women produced and the double day they worked in the collective era did not count as labor. It was neither remunerated nor publicly recognized, because it appeared to take place in a separate domain from that of the collective. Focused on the need to mobilize women's agricultural labor, and supported by the belief, which they picked up from Friedrich Engels, that in doing so they were contributing to women's emancipation, party-state authorities never fully confronted the degree to which women's invisible labor was underwriting the entire enterprise of rural socialist construction and helping to generate what you might call socialist accumulation to fund the industrialization drive. Let me turn to the second major theme that emerges across the past 2 centuries. That is the theme of woman, capital W, as symbol in discussions about the state of China. From the early 19th century to the present, the figure of woman has been invoked repeatedly by state authorities and intellectuals of all political stripes as they have sought to imagine and shape a new China. The question of what women should do and be was a constant topic of public debate during China's transformation from empire to weak state to partially occupied territory by Japan during World War II, to nascent socialist republic, to post-Mao reform era world powerhouse. In the beginning, China was weak, thinkers argued. You saw this already with Liang Qichao, partly because Chinese social practices kept women footbound, cloistered, unproductive, and ignorant. Now remember, I'm talking about woman as symbol. I am not describing necessarily reality on the ground. Many followed Liang Qichao. In fact, the reason I put him up there first was he became the person who laid down a kind of foundational belief that women were economic parasites, narrow-minded, preoccupied with trivialities, and quarrelsome. And lots of people gave advice about how to address this situation and directions for what a modern woman should do and be. Women were glorified as mothers who could save the nation, or labor heroines who could hasten the achievement of socialism. I think it's almost fair to say that if it were not for the symbol of woman, capital W, most of China's major debates about modernity would have looked and sounded very different. Here again, I only have time to offer you a few examples of how the symbol of woman was deployed to imagine China's future. The first example dates from the 1920s and 1930s and was known as the new woman. Someone who is educated, gainfully employed in teaching or office work, eventually married at the appropriate time to an equally modern new man, whereupon she was to become the manager of a scientifically run, hygienic household, properly equipped with Western-style furniture and kitchen equipment. Ideally, she would have enough knowledge of science to keep bees, clean the house with Lysol, which I have to say was also recommended for use in women's personal hygiene around the world, including in China at this time, raise healthy modern children, and administer remedies such as Dr. Williams' pink pills for pale people to any family member who felt under the weather. And the new woman was also supposed to be well informed about national politics and align the interest of her household with the fate of the nation, joining in a boycott of Japanese goods as Japan encroached on Chinese territory, and pledging to buy national products whenever possible. It's unclear what the national products drive of the 1930s did to the pink pills for pale people, which continued to be advertised in almost every issue of every newspaper. But these messages about how a woman was a linchpin to build a strong nation were relentlessly promoted in magazines aimed at urban women's readership. Okay, the new woman was not entirely a real person. She's a kind of archetype. And the degree to which this model of womanhood was absorbed across urban society must have been uneven. Gradually, though, the idea of an educated and employed new woman became less controversial, increasingly domesticated as a modern homemaker. But my second example of woman as symbol is her mischievous younger sister, the irresponsible, seductive, and duplicitous modern girl, who emerged as a new figure of unease on the urban cultural landscape. If improving society and saving the nation were the tasks of a new woman, and responsible consumerism was the hallmark of a domesticated modern housewife, reckless behavior and wasteful consumption were the characteristics of a modern girl. The figure of the modern girl was prominent in Shanghai advertising and fiction in the 1930s. Every aspect of her bodily self-presentation was depicted. Permed hair, high heels, fashionable, often imported clothing, all requiring lavish outlays of money. She was sexy. Her dress was apt to be sleeveless and/or made of a flimsy fabric that revealed every feature of her breasts and much of her legs. Unlike respectable urban women, she smoked cigarettes in public as a sign of rebellion and sexual availability. And perhaps most disquieting to the men that worried in print about her, when a woman sported the modern girl look, a man could never be sure exactly who she was. College student, factory worker, secretary, recent rural migrant, prostitute. Unmarried modern girls appeared as deceitful, flirtatious, and greedy, and a man credulous enough to marry one might find her, said the magazine articles, uninterested in housework and motherhood, leaving him to manage the home while she continued her free-spending, sexually promiscuous ways. Her love of imports, especially cosmetics and perfume, were blamed for the minimal success of the movement to buy national goods and not foreign goods, and for China's trade deficit. She was thus a threat not only to individual men, but to national strength. Both figures, the new woman and the modern girl, were remote from the world of 85% of China's women who lived in the countryside. But these two, the new women and the modern girl, loomed very large as symbols. They could help China find modernity, or they could imperil it. Chinese writers and authorities across the political spectrum used woman as a potent symbol as they struggled to work out the local meaning of modernity for China in a world destabilized by world depression, the encroachment of Japan, and a revolutionary communist movement that took hold in the countryside and eventually resulted in the revolution of 1949. So that revolution, too, deployed woman as a symbol. And here I will offer you a third example, the rural woman as communist labor heroine. Before 1949, when the communists were confined to poor and economically marginal base areas in remote regions of China, they relied upon women to spin and weave for the troops, take over the farming when the men joined the Red Army, and, as here, maintain local security in villages. Note that most of these women are armed with spears rather than guns if you get past the first 2 or 3 women there. After the revolution, too, the main model promoted for rural women was the labor heroine who excelled at farming, led other women to the fields, and could instruct others on how to control insect pests and top a cotton plant. In short, she was a kind of walking ag extension station, meant to convey labor-intensive techniques to a marginally literate population through personal example. Don't send them a manual, send them a labor heroine. Often, women labor models were expert farmers in the 50s because they came from families where, before 1949, the men had died or run away to avoid conscription by the nationalist regime, or left long-term to seek gainful employment, leaving women to do the farming year-round, which was not really a thing women were supposed to do. Before 1949, it was a sign of economic vulnerability for a woman to work in the fields unescorted by a man, and it was stigmatized because it exposed women to sexual assault and allowed neighbors to gossip about their virtue. But after 1949, this very background made the women heroines, and many of them threw themselves into the project of building up agricultural production and were publicly praised for it. Women labor models were meant to model mobilization, not women's emancipation. Nevertheless, being a woman labor model was a gendered experience. Both men and women labor models were expected to work hard and create new production techniques, But only women labor models were routinely praised for doing all this stuff outside and then doing a good job of raising their children, treating the collective's livestock with maternal concern when the cows got sick, and maintaining domestic peace and harmony with their husbands and in-laws. Although I did once interview a labor model who got so exasperated with her husband's refusal to let her go to meetings that she chased him around and around the kitchen stove with a broom, threatening to beat him. But that didn't make it into the official propaganda. I only heard about that 40 years later through back channels. Women labor models had to be above reproach and controversy in their personal lives. They could not be subjects of community gossip. Perhaps for that reason, labor models were usually married women, not unmarried adolescents. Women labor models had to complete domestic tasks and manage the family's emotional life in a way that enhanced rather than interfered with collective production. Okay, I've given you a very fast survey of some of what we've learned about women's and gender history over the course of my years in the field. But even after all this information, there are things we can't get at, and I want to end with two brief examples of stubborn silences. The first concerns foot binding. During the late 19th and early 20th century, the foot-bound woman became the symbol of everything that was wrong with China. A massive movement to eliminate foot binding, in which missionaries were active but Chinese reformers also took a leading role, became a standard part of the platform of every 20th century political movement. Everyone agreed that women's feet needed to be unbound, except the mothers of rural daughters, who continued silently to bind their daughters' feet well into the 20th century. So here's a paradox. Everything that we know about women's foot binding, we know from the anti-foot binding movement. But foot binding was a practice that had been going on for about 1,000 years before it became subject to critique. Astoundingly, during most of those 1,000 years, it was so taken for granted and considered such a private process that almost nothing was written about it. Certainly nothing by women, who were in fact the people responsible for passing on the practice. Here you see an elite woman with very small feet and her servant with somewhat larger but still bound feet. Almost nothing was written about it. Certainly nothing by women, who were in fact the people responsible for passing on the practice. No man was allowed near the scene of foot binding, which began at about age 6. Girls in poor families also had their feet bound later and somewhat more loosely, perhaps to facilitate work in the fields. By the time foot binding made it into print, it was being written about as a form of child abuse, a sign that China could only be saved by Christianity, or an indication that China was backward and needed a revolution. But what about the 1,000 years leading up to that? How did mothers understand their own motivations for binding their daughters' feet? Why did they regard the practice as absolutely necessary and unremarkable? In the absence of any writing whatsoever about this topic, scholars have no shortage of theories. Some have said that parents must have wanted to make sure that girls could not run around freely outside, since female seclusion was also becoming the norm during this time. Scholars more interested in political economy have recently argued that mothers bound their daughters' feet so that they would stay home and spin and weave and contribute to the household economy. Although one has to ask, was there an easier way to keep one's children at home that did not involve actually altering their body in a painful way by daily binding over a period of several years? Some have noted it appears that foot binding became a requirement for making a respectable marriage, or marrying up the social scale, since the custom started with upper-class people and spread downward. Still others have said that it was taken for granted as a form of body modification that proved you were a respectable person who had fully entered into culture. But the truth is, all of these remain theories, some more convincing than others, but we have absolutely no way to conclude from the surviving historical record that one makes more sense than another. And in fact, even interviewing elderly women whose feet were bound, as some scholars did before these women died out, is less than illuminating. Why? Because these women were girls during a time when foot binding was already under attack. And many of their memories concern warlord soldiers in the 1920s riding into rural villages and forcibly unbinding their feet, or fining their families for binding their feet, and then riding off triumphantly with the women's bindings stuck on the edges of their bayonets. This suggests that for some women, the process of unbinding, which by the way could be as painful as binding, was accompanied by a local political terror. But by the time these women were interviewed, foot binding was so associated with backwardness and feudalism that it was almost impossible to get an account from anyone of how it might have been understood before that critique came on the scene. Now look, don't get me wrong, I'm not defending foot binding, much less arguing for its return. What I'm saying is that here we have this practice that was absolutely taken for granted by millions of people for close to a millennium, and we still have no clue what it meant to the people who were actually doing it. Or even whether they didn't write about it because they were not literate, because they thought it was too intimate a process to discuss in writing, or because they regarded it as so ordinary that they didn't think about it any more than we think today about many aspects of our own personal hygiene. We just don't know what that silence means. And for an issue which caused such huge controversy and was taken as so emblematic of women's status across that late 19th and the entire 20th century, that is an astounding silence, one of historic significance. My final example of a stubborn silence comes from the Socialist period and the labor models I have mentioned at several points already. In the late 90s and early 2000s, as part of a research project of my own, I had the opportunity to interview several of these labor models who had become regionally or nationally famous for cotton growing in the late 50s and early 60s. They were uniquely interesting interview subjects because they were virtually the only rural women who made it into the news in the 1950s and 1960s with actual names attached, not in the aggregate. They were the very rare non-elite women for whom there was a paper trail. And so I very much wanted to flesh out, or maybe contradict, the official propaganda accounts with their own stories of what life was like back then. And yet, although I spent many hours interviewing various labor models, what I learned from them was very uneven. Several were excellent storytellers, but it was clear that they had told the story of their origins and heroic achievements so often that the narratives were extremely polished, and I was unlikely to find out anything I couldn't already see in the 1960s news accounts. It took a certain amount of interview improvisation to derail them from their appointed stories. It was not that they were lying to me, it was that they had come to so completely inhabit their personae as labor models that they virtually couldn't conceive of their own past, apart from these stories. And then again, with some women, like the one on the right, there were uncomfortable silences, especially when we asked about political difficulties that they might have suffered during the Chinese Cultural Revolution in the 60s. This one on the right, the most famous person we interviewed, fell silent when we asked her about that and then abruptly ended the interview. My Chinese research partner and I absolutely could not tell whether it was because she was offended by the questions, re-traumatized by recalling painful memories she didn't want to articulate, overcome by forgetfulness, or just very tired since she was elderly and quite frail at the time we interviewed her. So here is a case where even oral history does not allow you to get much past the unsatisfactory official paper trail. And that's significant not so much because I want to dig down deeply into the soul of any given labor heroine, but because the question of how a major revolution affected the daily lives of women remains very difficult to answer, even when the woman herself is sitting in front of you. And that is a stubborn silence we are unlikely ever to be able to penetrate. But then again, perhaps it's our inability to satisfactorily answer these questions and lay them to rest that actually keeps me coming back for more, continuing to try to scratch that historian's itch. I hope I have given you a sense today of how far that inquiry can take us, as well as where it still can't go, and conveyed some sense of why unearthing the history of Chinese women has been so fascinating to me. Thanks.
questions for Gail? We have a few minutes here. And could we have the lights on, please?
Gail, it's a fascinating panorama, but I'm curious about the third silence, or at least a topic that you didn't address in your talk, and namely the impact on women of the one-child policy, which in my understanding disfavored women children.
Yeah, the one-child family policy, which I just lectured on to my students yesterday, and you have to stop and explain things like what is an IUD, because birth control moved past that and then back toward it, so I suddenly realized they were looking at me blankly. Was put into effect in 1979 when the Chinese leadership discovered while they hadn't been paying attention, the population had gone from about 450 million to it was closing in on 1 billion. And so people were asked to, compelled in the cities really by virtue of fines and all kinds of pressure to have just one kid, and in the countryside we're told they could have 2. But since marriage was patrilocal, like I said, women moved in with their husbands' families. If you had 1 or even 2 kids and they were girls, there went your social security system. And at the time of the beginning of the economic reforms in the late 1970s, when the land was being decollectivized, your household was your social security system. So if all the able-bodied people were going to grow up and move out, you were in real trouble. So this policy wasn't meant to be gender discriminatory. It was meant to be gender neutral and limit the size of the population. But what it ended up producing was terrible gender discrimination, including, in extreme cases, especially at the beginning, infanticide, and for a long time, abandonment of unwanted girl children. And after that, as the countryside developed more and ultrasound machines became common in every county town, just quiet sex-selective abortions, even though it's illegal for a doctor to tell prospective parents the sex of the fetus. You could nod, you could smile, you could wink, and so forth. What was really interesting to me investigating this a bit was that although this is obviously a terrible abrogation of women's rights and a sign of gender discrimination, there's 2 things. One, what you see is the state creating the situation and then scrambling to fix it. So suddenly you start seeing all of these, in Pop Science magazines, articles that say, let us tell you about XX chromosomes and XY chromosomes. So if you, sir, have a girl child, that's because you contributed a particular chromosome. It's not your wife's fault. Do not beat her. Do not blame her. Do not cast her aside. The second thing I hadn't been expecting, though, was that there was a real generational difference in how people received this policy. For women that were of their childbearing years in the 50s, who would have 8 or 9 kids, and before the revolution maybe 2 of them would have survived. Now they had 8 or 9 kids, there's no civil war, there's improving public health, and so forth. 8 or 9 of them would live and have to be fed and clothed and made shoe soles for and all of that. Those women, who were the older women I interviewed for that research project, were exhausted. And as soon as tubal ligations became available to rural women in the early 70s, a lot of them sneaked off without telling their families and got them because they already had 4 or 5 kids. And for them, that was it. When this policy came down in the late 70s, they were often put in charge of enforcing the policy in the villages. And they were real true believers in the benefits of birth control. Why didn't we have birth control? The state told us everything and controlled everything and told us what to grow and paid no attention to birth control. Now we have a chance to rectify that. And they ran smack up against this new situation in the reforms where people, A, wanted the state out of their lives, and B, needed the labor power in their own households. And so you have older women pitted against younger women in a really serious way. So, like every misbegotten state policy, the state policy is part of the question. What happens when it hits the ground is what's really, really interesting. So thank you for bringing that up. Yes, Virginia.
I have a comment and a question. It would be interesting to make some comparisons with Europe during the Crusades, when the men went off to fight and the women were suddenly in charge of the states of the aristocracy. I mean, that's the upper class. But also, and so my question is, what could you have done if you hadn't been able to go to China? And how much time do you need to spend in China in order to do the kind of research you're doing? Because it seems like it's maybe 99%.
That's certainly been true across most of my scholarly life, although one thing that's really changing it right now is the massive digitization of all kinds of archival holdings and records there, so you can get enormous amounts of stuff while sitting in your living room in your pajamas now. There's a caveat attached to that. A lot of the archival stuff, many archives have been closing down for years on end to digitize, and when they come back online, they look to have been a little airbrushed and curated. And so you're not...
Because so much was, I think, interviews and stuff.
Yeah, well, there's that. The interviews have been important. But one of the things I found out is you can have an interview subject sitting in front of you. You know, you always say, if only I could go back in time and talk to that person. Well, it turns out that person has a faulty memory, that person has investments in a particular story of the past, that person is maybe a liar, that person is really talking to you but yelling out the window in the general direction of her daughter-in-law, at whom she's very upset. And so you're not getting an uncomplicated story with an oral history. It's just as contaminated as every other source. Yeah, I think time in China is really necessary.
And time, not just the one day where you get one interview.
That's right, that's right. It's good to go and hang out, but it is also, for years, but it is also subject to the vagaries of the political climate there right now. And there I have to say, the news is not good. I'm watching my grad students increasingly being greeted at archives as though they are criminals, thieves, and spies, even if they're citizens of the People's Republic of China, as some of them are. If they're associated with a U.S. university, everyone is afraid to show them stuff for fear that later it will turn out to have been the wrong thing to do, because this is a period of real political tightening. So, I mean, it reminds me of when I first started doing research. I was lucky that I had, free roaming rights to run around Chinese villages, for instance. I think it's harder now than it was 20 years ago.
Because you were early.
Yeah, that's right.
So maybe one more and then you can come up and ask.
Yes, Michael.
I was struck by this practice that lasted apparently 2,000 years of foot binding. Did it come from a distorted sense of beauty, of having a prettier foot that way?
Yeah.
The women who had to work in the fields didn't realize that it was very impractical. And is there any comparison with the practice in the West of women who use corsets to bind themselves in a very distorted way? I mean, if it's just a distorted sense of beauty, it hasn't ended now.
Right. Right. Well, there is a myth about the origin of foot binding, that an emperor saw his favorite concubine dancing, and she had very small feet that came down to little tiny pointy toes, and he liked it so much that everyone in the kingdom started emulating it by binding their kids' feet. We do know it started with the elite, and then with a kind of lagging emulation, it moved down. But it is not true that it prevented women from working in the fields. If you look at, the record is mute about this, but one thing we have is a lot of surviving bound foot shoes. And there are some that are galoshes for working in the rice paddies, for bound feet. It is quite clear that women got out and around. Once they were bound, as long as the bindings were maintained, people could move around, although they're walking, as you can see, on their toes bent under the arch. It's not an optimal situation, but it did not mean that they just stayed home. So, I've told you almost everything we know about this, and we are really up against the edges of what were people thinking. But of course, the comparison to corsets has been made, because corsets didn't just keep you like this when you were in them. They deformed you over time. And they had to be applied every day in the same way that bindings had to be changed all the time. So it's useful for me when I'm talking with my students so that they don't do this thing where they say, oh, that other weird, exotic place where they do these incomprehensible things and people are not quite human. If you start talking about corsets and various other practices, and you say, the interesting question here is, how come something is acceptable, and then looks unacceptable? You can kind of reframe the question so they're not sitting there feeling like we're civilized, they're not, which is not ever where you want to go with a history class. Then you've lost that battle. Thank you all very much.
I will.
That's better than.
Tell them I'm working out.
Tell it. No question. Is it left?